I'd really like to thank World of Warships for sponsoring this video. If you hit the link below, you can download the game and begin your naval career today. By using the promo code FIRE, you'll get 200 doubloons, the premium battleship USS Texas, 20 Restless fire camouflages, a 7-day premium account, and 1 million credits. Now, I've actually been a big fan of this game for some time, for several reasons. As you make your way through the game, you actually traverse your way through history, and in the process, you relive one of the golden ages of naval warfare. I think the developers have done just an amazing job keeping up with the historical context I've actually learned from this game. The game is free to play and available on PC. It is comprised of team-based sea battles, which means you gotta be good at both tactics and strategy. And if you're not, trust me, your opponents are going to be teaching you a lesson in this. The game features 400 historical ships in an immersive environment where you can customize your ships and deliver your opponent a not-so-friendly hello. What's more, you're not limited to just cruisers or battleships. If you feel like launching a bunch of planes from your aircraft carrier, done. If you want to blaze in at top speed and torpedo somebody with your destroyer, you got it. And if that whole surface combat thing is just not your style, get your periscope on in your own submarine. So hit that link below and get started with World of Warships today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. In July of 1187, an Italian ship made its way across the Mediterranean towards the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On the foredeck stood a tall, formidable man gazing at the horizon. He was a nobleman born in northwest Italy to a family renowned for their fortitude on the battlefield. He himself was no stranger to war. Since a youth, he was trained in combat, and he had fought alongside his siblings on several campaigns. Eventually, he came into the employment of the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos. Though he had distinguished himself in imperial service, he felt that his compensation was lacking. What's more, his brother had died under somewhat dubious circumstances in Constantinople just a few years prior. His relations with the Byzantine dramatically soured. He became a wanted man. He was embroiled in conspiracy and dubbed by some to be a murderer. As he was recently widowed, he decided to leave the Eastern Roman Empire behind and join his father in the Holy Land to seek a new fortune. This man's name was Conrad of Montferrat. He was known for his intelligence, his skill as a warrior, and in time, for his absolute ruthlessness. In mid-July of 1187, his ship came into sight to the city of Acre. But he could tell right away that something was wrong. The church bells were not ringing. So instead of sailing into the great harbor of the city, a scout was deployed to find out what had happened. From the scout, Conrad learned of the disaster of the Battle of Hattin. He learned that the army of Jerusalem was destroyed, King Guy captured, and the Sultan, Saladin, had moved quickly to take many cities. Sidon, Beirut, and even Acre, which had fallen only a few days prior to his arrival. However, despite this devastating news, he also ascertained that the city of Tyre remained in Crusader hands, and that would be his next destination. He traveled north and arrived at Tyre just in the nick of time. The shattered forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had rallied to the city, but were in a state of panic. Conrad assumed command. He went to work fortifying the city and organizing the scattered and broken crusaders into nothing less than a viciously effective defense. When Saladin arrived, he expected yet another easy victory. Instead, he met stout resistance led by the Marquis de Montferrat. Realizing this, the Sultan brought forth Conrad's father and offered him as a bargaining chip if the city was to capitulate. From his ramparts, Conrad bellowed his response. "Tie him to a stake. What do I care? I shall be the first to shoot him, for he is old and worthless." At which point the Marquis pulled out a crossbow and took a shot at his own father. This both horrified and impressed Saladin, who realized that negotiation was not going to work with this man. A full-blown siege with multiple assaults on the city followed, but failed. This would inspire a Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, to comment that Conrad was a devil incarnate in his ability to defend a town and a man of extraordinary courage. The Sultan decided that he had more pressing issues. After all, the city of Jerusalem was now surrounded and was ripe for conquest. Leaving Tyre behind, however, would be a mistake that Saladin would soon regret. After Jerusalem fell in early October of 1187, Saladin returned to Tyre. Restless in Warriors of God covers it well. Quote, "In November of 1187, the Sultan moved on Tyre for the second time. If he was able to capture this last vestige now, he would literally succeed in throwing the Christians into the sea." Since Saladin's first assault earlier in that year, the able renegade Conrad of Montferrat had been able to strengthen Tyre's defenses considerably. Christian refugees continued to stream into the enclave from Jerusalem and other captured places. The city was veritably bursting at the seams with the beneficiaries of Saladin's tender and ill-advised charity. End quote. Saladin knew that only a combined ground and naval assault could take Tyre. His men surrounded the city, dug entrenchments, and began to build siege towers. An Egyptian fleet was deployed to blockade the harbor. However, Conrad reversed the situation completely. During a daring night raid on December 30th, he sent in some of his elite soldiers, basically medieval Navy SEALs. They left the guarded harbor of Tyre, found, and then boarded some of the Egyptian ships, taking the Muslim sailors by surprise. The inexperienced crews panicked. They ran overboard and then swam for their lives. These ships were towed into the harbor, quickly manned, and then the combined force launched an all-out attack on the Sultan's remaining ships. For Saladin, it was a complete fiasco. His navy was neutralized. The Sultan decided to cut his losses. In early 1188, he moved on. His vast empire, after all, had enemies on other fronts. The defenders of Tyre, meanwhile, were jubilant. Conrad was a hero. The Sultan now needed a new strategy. Guy of Lusignan had been Saladin's prisoner since the Battle of Hattin. His kingdom of Jerusalem now only existed in his mind. The Sultan figured he was harmless. He should have thought harder. Guy, after all, being of the race of men, above all else, desired power. Saladin figured he could use this motivation to his benefit and released him, figuring his presence would undermine Conrad's authority. The Sultan, however, did make Guy promise never to raise arms again and eventually leave the Holy Land. Guy was set loose and immediately broke his promise. He appeared before Tyre demanding the city. He was, after all, king. Conrad would have nothing to do with the man and barred him entry. Guy, however, was not done yet. As reinforcements came into the city from the west, he lured them to his side. By summer of 1189, he had the loyalty of 700 knights, the backing of the Templars, and an army of 9,000 men. It would seem that the Sultan had made another mistake, and this was quickly realized as Guy marched his new army south. In August of 1189, he arrived at Acre. Acre was one of the most important cities in the Levant, a bustling cosmopolitan town with a thriving market and an impressive port that made it one of the most vital gateways to the Holy Land. Guy moved his army right in and settled down for a siege. Saladin was fighting on multiple fronts, but he deployed a portion of his army to relieve the city, but by the time they got there, it was too late. The Crusaders had created a double entrenchment, one facing the city and the other protecting their rear. They had become besiegers and besieged alike. Both sides then brought in reinforcements, fresh crusaders arriving by sea and the Sultan's men from the lands of his empire. Over the next several months, well into October, a massive tug-of-war ensued, one attack followed by counterattack. Christian and Muslim casualties were extensive, but the battle lines were set, and each month the fortifications only got stronger. It had become stalemate, and a prolonged one at that. Indeed, the Siege of Acre would be one of the longest in crusading history. James Reston summarizes it really well. Quote, "In 1191, as Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip Augustus of France arrived in Sicily for the trip to the Holy Land, they knew this. Tyre remained in Christian hands as a toehold, but its arrogant lord, the Marquis of Montferrat, could not be counted upon for his support. Frederick Barbarossa was dead and his army had dissolved in Asia Minor. For nearly a year and a half, Acre had been under siege, but the siege's commander was the weak King Guy, whose legitimacy was undermined by his poor judgment and incompetence." End quote. The Crusader High Command at this point was heavily divided. When Philip Augustus, the King of France, arrived at Acre on April 20th, 1191, he sensed the political discord immediately. Guy of Lusignan's wife, Sibylla, who was the Queen Regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had died the year before. She just happened to be Guy's only legitimate claim to the throne. Sensing an opportunity, Conrad of Montferrat quickly married Sibylla's sister, putting him in line as the next king of Jerusalem. Philip Augustus thought this over for a bit, and in the end decided to back up Conrad. Guy, meanwhile, looking for new allies, traveled to Cyprus to meet up with Richard. When he arrived, he pledged his loyalty to the English king. The division lines were thus set, Philip and Conrad, and Guy and Richard. But despite this divisiveness, Philip was still able to advance the siege. By May of 1191, the Crusaders had sealed off the city. The land entrenchments now spanned over 2 miles, and the Latin Navy provided a very effective blockade of the harbor. Richard, meanwhile, had been delayed on Cyprus, but not wanting to miss out on any potential for glory in the Holy Land, he decided to, quickly capture the whole island. And on June 5th, 1191, his contingent departed from Famagusta. His first order of business was to alleviate the siege of Acre. Richard first stopped in Tyre and was banned by Conrad from entering the city, so be it, he decided to move south. On June 7th, his fleet came upon a behemoth of a ship. The thing was huge, 3 masts, multiple levels, and hiding in the fog. The English king quickly figured out that this was a relief ship sent by Saladin. It was loaded with provisions and elite troops, enough to keep the garrison at Acre going for months. When discovered, the Leviathan attempted to escape, at which point Richard scolded his men, saying, "Will you allow this ship to get away untouched and uninjured? Shame, you have become cowards from too much sloth. Too many victories over weak foes. The whole world knows you are in the service of the cross." At this admonishment, his troops surged forward and launched a frenzied attack. When the sun set that day, Saladin's ship and his hope to resupply his garrison sunk into the waves. When the Sultan learned of the loss of this immense vessel, he lamented, "Oh God, I have now lost Acre." Richard arrived the next day on June 8, 1191, and assumed command of all Crusader forces. From that moment onwards, he never let up. In fact, at one point, the English king came down with a terrible fever, but demanded his men put him on a royal stretcher. He was then paraded around while using a crossbow to pick off Acre's defenders. Over the next month, the siege continued. Richard brought in more reinforcements from the sea. Massive catapults and siege towers were constructed. Bombardment of the walls intensified, and then breaches began to open up. Saladin also brought in more of his army and would respond by launching attacks against the Crusaders from their other front, distracting them long enough to allow the garrison of Acre to rebuild some of their fortifications. But Richard knew it was only a matter of time before they would simply be starved out. Indeed, on July 7th, the Muslim garrison sent a desperate appeal to Saladin for help, which the Sultan was simply unable to answer. But to their credit, after nearly 2 years of siege and after loss of their supply and reinforcement, the Muslim defenders of Acre fought one last grave battle to break out on July 11th, but it would fail. The crusader position was now too strong. And thus, the very next day, on July 12th, 1191, Acre fell. Richard had won the first round. Conrad of Montferrat had left the Siege of Acre kind of in a pouty way when he realized that Richard had backed up Guy of Lusignan as the next king of Jerusalem. He was asked by both sides to come back to head negotiations for the release of the Muslim garrison, which happened to be approximately 2,700 men. Saladin now knew he was not dealing with an inept leader like Guy of Lusignan. He needed time to bring in more of his army. The Sultan purposely stalled negotiations in an attempt to buy this time. Richard, on the other hand, had already packed up his siege engines and was preparing the next portion of his campaign. The problem were his prisoners of war. They were an encumbrance to movement. Both the Sultan and the king knew this. So, as the talks dragged on into early August, Richard had had enough. He threatened to execute all of his prisoners. Saladin didn't budge, and in my mind I like to think he was trying to call Richard's bluff. I mean, after all, no man can be that barbaric, right? On August 22nd, 1191, Saladin got his answer. The Crusader king ordered his prisoners to be tied together, paraded to the middle ground within sight of both armies. And then, one by one, along the road to Nazareth, all 2,700 men were beheaded. Saladin did likewise with his prisoners that he held in Damascus, and all across the Ayyubid Empire other Christian prisoners faced torture and persecution. The Third Crusade had now leveled up to a new era of atrocity. The time had arrived for Richard to move on, but even before the massacre at Acre, he had to contend with problems within his own ranks. Philip Augustus was losing his nerve for war in the Holy Land. Richard was being cast as the hero, and Philip felt as if he was playing second string. The rivalry between the two kings had not abated since Sicily when Richard decided not to marry Philip's sister. Not to mention the quarrel on who should be the next king of Jerusalem only intensified their animosity. What's more, King Philip became ill several times. By the records, it would seem that dysentery was the main cause, which, to be fair, would make anybody lose their enthusiasm. On July 22nd, just 10 days after the fall of Acre, Philip announced his intention to return to France. A delegation was sent to the English king asking for pardon to leave. Richard advised against this, but Philip was not deterred. Restless explains, quote, on July 29, 1191, a week after his shocking notice of betrayal, Philip again sought Richard's official blessing to leave. Having no choice, and perhaps glad to be shed of his faint-hearted companion, Richard could only extract a promise. Under no circumstance was the French king to do harm to any of Richard's land in Europe. Thus disgraced, reviled, and considerably poorer than he had been just a few days before, the King of France skulked out of the Holy Land with 5 ships, 2 of which had to be borrowed from Richard. End quote. Of the 3 kings who had ventured out from their homeland to bring war to Saladin, only Richard now remained. The English king's mind went to work taking in the grand strategic situation. Saladin, on one end, had plentiful resources at his disposal in terms of manpower and material, but he didn't have command of the sea. The Sultan had also adopted a scorched earth policy in order to deprive Richard of any potential resources. He'd even gone so far as to level several coastal cities, including Haifa and Caesarea. Meanwhile, Richard needed to expand his beachhead. His first order of duty was to rebuild Acre. The city's fortifications were restored, and the port once again bristled with activity as more supplies were brought in. Richard then took the time to train and reorganize his men. In line with his character, he even held a jousting tournament. When he felt ready, he and his army moved out, under the close scrutiny of Saladin's scouts. They reported to the Sultan that the Crusader army moved cautiously, taking their time, keeping formation, stopping at rivers to replenish their water, and making it a point to rest. All the while, the King's Great Armada provided naval support, which negated Saladin's policy of destroying all the crops. Within 15 days, the army had moved just 60 miles to the south, within range of the old Crusader fortress of Arsuf. This was going to be a serious problem for Saladin. If Richard could not be stopped here, he could take Jaffa just 6 miles to the south. Jaffa was a major port, which brought in supplies directly to Jerusalem. Thus, with the city under Crusader control, Richard would finally have the ability to move inland on Jerusalem itself. Saladin decided to act. Just north of Arsuf was a wooded region, one of the few in Palestine. It was bordered by a small river known as the River of Reeds. This was a perfect place for an ambush. On September 3rd, Richard's army arrived at the forest. The Sultan maneuvered his men in for the kill. But just before hostilities broke out, a delegation arrived at the Sultan's camp, wanting to talk. Saladin took this seriously. He deployed his brother to handle the negotiations. But the talks faltered, and it soon became clear to the Sultan that this was all a ruse in order to give Richard time to move. While the negotiations were going on, the English king had moved his army beyond the River of Reeds, through the forest, and was even then on the march south. Richard was making his way towards the relative safety of Arsuf, but his army was at that point traversing a large open field flanked by hills and woods to the east. As expected, Saladin was beyond ticked off. He didn't want to waste any more time. On September 7th, 1191, he sent his army in. The Crusader army was estimated to be about 11,000 strong. The Muslim force outnumbered them and was estimated to be about 25,000. Richard maneuvered his men nearly on the coastline on his march south in order to protect his right flank. He then deployed his men into 3 lines. The baggage train was closest to the coast, along with his archers and crossbowmen. The next line was his heavy cavalry, with the Templars and his own native warriors taking up the vanguard, and the Hospitallers defending the rear. The final line, which was furthest from the coast, consisted of his heavy infantry. They were deployed in such a way that they would be essentially facing perpendicular to the line of march. This way they would create a solid wall against an attack coming from the land, basically a long shield of men. Saladin took a position in the center of his men on the wooded hills overlooking the coast. He allowed Richard and his men to march a few miles down the road, hoping that the heat of the day would fatigue the Crusaders. Then, with a single command, he unleashed a portion of his cavalry which poured out of the high ground. Estimated to be over 10,000 horsemen strong, it was a well-coordinated charge that came down to Richard's army and slammed into his infantry. The main point of impact came on the rear of Richard's line. This forced the infantry and the mounted Hospitallers to be compressed into a smaller and smaller space. An eyewitness at the time would lament, "Our people, so few in numbers, were hemmed in by the multitude of the Arabs. They had no means of escape even if they had wanted one. They were shut in like a flock of sheep in the jaws of wolves, with nothing but the sky above and the enemy all around." The Muslims continued to press the attack, but the well-armored Crusader infantry made progress difficult. Instead, Saladin's men would target the Crusaders' horses, hoping to decrease any potential for counterattack. Saladin's forces pressed the offensive further. They even got around to the rear of Richard's line, threatening another flank. The situation for the Crusaders at this point was looking really bad. The master of the Hospitallers, sensing desperation, sent word to the king, "We are violently pressed in by the enemy, my lord. We're in danger of eternal infamy if we do not dare to return their blows. Each of us is losing our horses. Why should we bear this shame any further? We must attack." To which the king responded something akin to, "I find your lack of faith disturbing," though he was actually recorded by history as saying, "Patience, good master, it is you who must resist their attack. No one can be everywhere at once. The line must hold." In Richard's mind, he was hoping to make it to the relative safety of Arsuf, but his greatest fear was for a portion of his line to break off on its own charge. Maintaining formation was everything, but then everything took on a life of its own. James Reston explains, quote, "The spark came from two knights, a marshal of the hospital and a Flemish knight and boon companion of Richard. Without authorization, they burst through the protecting line of infantry, shouting an invocation to St. George, and began to attack the attackers. Instantly, as if a stretched rubber band had snapped, the infantry line parted and the rest of the Hospitallers charged. The commander had no choice but to follow. The charge of the rear guard spread quickly to the center and then to the vanguard of the Templars. It was as if this brilliant dynamic strategy had been planned all along. In the center, and as if on cue, without the king lifting his hand or a trumpet sounding a single order, the cavalry charge became general. The effect of this rolling wave was devastating. The Muslim ranks broke in terror and general confusion. The front line of the Muslim attackers who were pressed in close and who had dismounted from their horses were totally cut down. An eyewitness would say their bearded heads lay thick as swathes at harvest time, and the soldiers behind them fled in disarray." End quote. Richard used the charge to his advantage. He was seen by the Sultan leading his men directly into Saladin's right flank, which broke, and then into his center, which also broke. A Muslim scribe would later write, "The rout was complete."